Today I'm going to begin to talk about some of the patterns that show up in my work, whether I look at my interviews, whether I look at data I've collected, data I've created. So one of my quests to seek answers to questions um, that I've been observing, one of the observations I've made is that in my interactions with curriculum developers, I find that I'm beginning to see more, not beginning to see, but I see more and more where we depart in our thinking. A lot of times it looks like we're doing the same thing, we're using the same framework, but we don't necessarily agree in the approach, in the expectations. And so I've been asking the question, trying to figure out why. What is it in my thinking that's different? What is it in their thinking that's different? And I've also been trying to figure out how do I, as someone who has developed a new way of thinking about relevant information and of positioning some of our negative experiences by looking at our strengths. And how do I work with other individuals who think differently? And so I've been mulling this thought over for, I probably would say for months, or probably for weeks. It allowed me to revisit an idea. It's more than idea. It's allowed me to revisit the first point that I want to look at. And I want to spend some time to delve into this and to share some of the conclusions I've come to. And that is, I want to talk about motivated thinking. Motivated thinking, first of all, there was research done by Molden and Higgins. It's a paper I cited in my recent paper that had to do with creating an instrument to look at self-efficacy indicators in STEM students and non-STEM students who were enrolled in an introductory bio course. One of the factors that resulted from this research, which had to do with expectancy, led me to look at a little bit more at motivated thinking. And I did not expect to revisit motivated thinking later on, but it kept coming up in patterns, even during my curriculum development. And so I continue to talk about some of the aha moments I've had by reading this article. One of the things Molden and Higgins highlight about motivated thinking is how it influences not only how we think, our motivation influences how we think, but also how we process information, the type of knowledge we might conceive as important. And they talk about the importance of attributes and of our desire to have certain attributes and how that might allow us to make positive associations with certain, ideas or outcomes, which outcome was one of the influences they talked about. Outcome motivation or directional motivation. But one of the things that really stood out to me in their article as they were talking about motivated thinking was this. They highlighted something that I think is so relevant to education and even in my own experiences in talking to people and actually in engaging with students. They talked about how an individual who's had success in certain areas will have high expectations of others, such as an educator would have high expectations of your students if you've had success in an area. Now, what was interesting to note was that one of the things they mentioned about having high expectation might also mean perceiving students as having either low efficacy or low achieving. The other thing they noted was they talked about how educators, not educators specifically, they were just talking about people in their study in general, but they mentioned that someone who might have experienced a failure or setback in another area might have low expectations of others, such as, again, I'm including the such as because I'm using this word to frame our understanding of education, but may have low expectations of students. In other words, view them as high achieving. Now, there's so much in there in those two And this was based on research that they have looked at and different outcomes. And I want to say that I am citing this to use it to trigger some interesting conversations, not to necessarily say that one thing is the answer, which is a tendency within our society. We tend to like to, as Dewey put it, we like to suspend thinking in favor of an outcome or a conclusion rather than allow ourselves to persist in understanding or thinking, because that can lead to a lot of uncomfortable discomfort, especially if it comes to looking at ourselves, understanding ourselves, which is one of the things the article talks about, and we can talk on and on about that. But let's come back to that later on. I want to go back to the distinction that was made by these researchers when they looked at research that looked at those who were high achieving or those who had achieved success who had high expectations. So I'm going to first, before I give you some stories about my own experience with that, I'm going to ask you, which camp would you say you fall in? Would you say that, can you see yourself as an individual who has achieved has achieved well in a certain area, and that this has led you to have high expectations of others or students in this area, thus perhaps even viewing them as low achievers? Or are you in the camp where, because you've had such challenges and such failures, or had some setbacks, where your expectations are lower and hence viewing students more as successful in this area? So when I think about either of these, I see pluses and I see minuses for both. And I do think that I think we need to find a balance between both forms of thinking, because I see positives and I see negatives in both. Let me give you an example of how this understanding of motivated thinking has influenced my own teaching. And it's interesting, when I try to think about my own experience, I had to think of which part of my own experience might even have led me to be this way. And I'll give you an example from both. So one of the areas that I realize that I have high expectations, that I have had high expectations of students, that I've really had to modify and scaffold in the years, is in the ability to be independent learners and thinkers. And over the years, I've had to really understand how students learn and understand what type of scaffolds they would need. And the most significant part of that is a lot of it had to do with helping students to understand, not only how much work, because that's a question that came up. You'd have a student who would do work, and you give the same instructions to both. You can ask them both if they understood the instructions, and then both of them define effort differently based on their own experience, right? One might spend a few hours and give you a couple pages of paper. One might spend a few hours and give you a paragraph of paper, a paragraph. And one might spend a little less time, much less time, 10 minutes, and give you their thoughts. And so what became significant in really understanding how to give students expectations of what is a good enough effort, right? I'm sure that's one of the things you see over and over again in asking students. But that's been an important distinction that I've had to make to help students understand what's a good enough effort, because someone might say, but I tried so hard and why did I get that? And so what does trying hard really mean? So I've had to scaffold that in the way I give assignments. And so at the end, at the end of the day, what I've ended up doing is I've started to grade processes rather than just the final outcomes, but mainly processes. But one of the things that I think, when I look back at my childhood now after reading this, it struck me. When I was in high school, I liked the sciences and I wanted to know the sciences. And I went to high school. It was, well, I guess I'll tell you, it was a convent run by nuns. And the only subject we didn't offer in high school was physics. And so what I did was I got the physics textbook and I read the physics textbook back to back, literally. And I remember my mom got a physics teacher from another school to meet with me a couple times just to do some experiments. But I read the whole physics textbooks and then took the final exam that I did for all the other science classes. And, I ended up getting distinctions in the same way I did for chemistry and biology that I had a teacher for. And so I look back now and I realize, wow, so I actually did not realize until now reading this again and reflecting on it, that one of the high expectations I had, one of the reasons for the high expectations in terms of that level of independence is I had independently just taught myself a whole subject that people might consider difficult. And I did all the problems, because, math was one of my strengths until I got to college. That's another story. We'll talk about that another time. Like how it can be your strength until you get to, what is considered one of the best schools. And so, and I do have discussion and reasons and perspectives for that. But so, that's one of the things that influence. So that type of thinking has certainly motivated how I teach, and so has led me to create scaffolds. And so what do I want you to get out of this? Motivated thinking. There is a depth to motivated thinking that influences how we teach, how we think of teaching as educators. There is also the flip side. There is also the flip side where I've seen people with low expectations. I've tried to sometimes have low expectations with some things. It's very hard for me to have low expectations. But when I think about areas with less success for me, I think for me, the areas of less success relate to probably, I would say, more emotion. Well, it's interesting because I have success, but then I could think of areas of less success, especially with education. And so I'm thinking of certain emotional things, certain things like relating to students. As I had mentioned I think I wrote about this in my book, growing up, Black and sheltered is not advantageous for living in our society, especially when it comes to really understanding our struggles in our society. And especially, that's something I'm so aware of now that it even influences how I, choose to make sure that there's a certain level of awareness that my son has as we raise him. So I do view my students as having certain of those type of emotional talents that really influences. I'll give you an example too. And I don't believe that this is just something I think. This is something I've heard other professors talk about. But one of the things we never have to worry about with our students is the reason they go into teaching. Many of our students have had experiences that lead them to want to give back to students like themselves, that lead them to want to connect with students like themselves and to want to do a good job. And I see that in myself as well. I've had people tell me, well, why don't you go and teach in, that school because it's better because these students XYZ. Or, well, why are you still here? Because you could teach in that XYZ school. That's usually more what someone might say to me, not realizing that there is a motivated thinking, a level of a motivation that drives me related to what the article talked about, attributes we like about others who are like us, or in other words, motivated to, for me, I guess I could just say that for me, my whole motivation is to promote and to advance people like myself. And so I allow that to drive me, and it has created it's created a great deal of internal conflict that has, not for me necessarily, but conflict with advancing the work I do, conflict with necessarily having the type of work I do be recognized, right? Because everyone has their own separate motivation, right? We want to make sure we're all motivated by making sure we all look good, right? And so this influences the knowledge that we associate with, the knowledge we choose, right? It's directional and it's outcomes associated. Okay. And so for my work, there is some directional and non-directional features. The directional portion of my work, which I didn't actually necessarily frame it this way in the book because I didn't necessarily, I'm purposely delving into motivated thinking because it's an area that I'm expanding on. But the directional aspect is, given our dark experience, what can we extract that's positive? Okay. And so this also leads to an internal drive because I have to work on, believe, and know and connect with those positive areas. Otherwise, it doesn't matter what I say or what I do. Okay, that internal, unknown, unconscious negativity would be the driver instead. And so this is also one of the reasons I want to talk about motivational thinking, because I've met so many people who talk about cultural relevance or want to create things that are culturally relevant. And when I look at it, I ask, well, culturally relevant for whom? And so what thinking does this continue to motivate? Often one of the thinking that I see it motivates is it almost seems to be an underlying belief that what is already here, what the outcome is, and I just don't want to use the word curricula, but the knowledge that is disseminated, and only this type of knowledge, and in the way it's presented, is good for everyone. And I'm not saying it's necessarily bad, but I'm just saying that the thinking that drives us is that a certain way of thinking and knowledge is better. Now, one of the reasons, and I guess this is where I'll, talk a little bit about what I've done. I am one of the program consultants for the new National Geographic high school biology textbook. And one of the reasons I was so excited to support that textbook is because of a really nice system that National Geographic has set up, where the scientists themselves, and in this case, diverse scientists, and more specifically, what was appealing to me was that they were Black scientists. They were scientists from Africa, they were African American scientists. And so to be able to include their work, not by doing something ceremonial, but because what they have done was already supported, was already showcased, it allowed us to see the motivation and the reasoning behind the type of questions they chose to pursue, the type of research they chose to do that was influenced by who they were. And so for me, I love it because we get we get a genuine perspective of science in action, motivated by who these scientists were, the culture of these scientists, the background of these scientists, the intention of these scientists. And in some cases, they were very similar goals in some ways. Now, I want to end here by saying that one of the things that all of this reminds me of is what Dr. Charles Drew, his work is one of the first work that I began to look at in trying to understand what Black scientists had accomplished. One of the things he talks about is how all of our successes paved the way for each other. And we can see that for anyone, right? We can see it for anyone's race. We can see it for anyone's culture. The influence of motivated thinking. At the end of the day, we can say a lot of things, right? We can say we want to promote the interests of Black people. We can say we want to have others succeed. But what you'll see in the end, especially in areas that are contradictory, and especially in an area where things may not make sense, is the influence of motivated thinking. And so it's important for you to ask, what is your internal motivation? And what do you plan to do about it? Well, I can tell you what others have done about it. There's been opposition, right? Opposition to anything that might lead to success for people who are underrepresented. Why? Because one part of motivated thinking, and the research shows, is the need and desire to view oneself as more successful than, and to make sure that that remains. And so part of needing to view oneself as more successful than means the drive to make sure others is less successful than. Motivated thinking is extremely powerful. Extremely powerful. And so we have to address it. We have to talk about it if we're going to have success for all. Thank you.